Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Catalyst webinar series presented by the Education Committee for the SCPGA. The Catalyst webinar series is a weekly educational platform for creating success and change in your club and career. We're super excited to have the one and only Andy Thuney on the webcast this morning. Andy, of course, was a staple at Hacienda Golf Club from 1983 to 2008, and he's remained the pro emeritus at Hacienda since, and served as SCPGA section president in 1986 and 87. He is considered an expert on the history of the game, and he's been grateful enough to come on in the past and do excerpts from the history of the game, and he's on today to continue his ongoing chronicles of the history of golf on the Catalyst webinar series. Good morning, Andy. Thank you for joining us this morning.
Thanks, John, and I appreciate you doing this for 4 years now. Boy, that's quite a tenure to doing all these webinars.
Yes, thank you. I enjoy it.
All righty, so I'll start off by saying good morning to Ula. That's Old Scottish for good morning to all of you folks out there, okay? So some of you may have listened in last time I did this, which was several months ago. In fact, it might have been last summer for all I can remember. And so I'm going to kind of scan through these first few pictures fairly rapidly. If you have some questions later on, just let me know, okay? So the first picture you see there is a stained glass window from Gloucester Cathedral, 1340. So that's kind of our first pictorial evidence that a game close to golf was played way back in those days, okay? Now, the origins of the game are somewhat varied. I'm going to give you a couple examples here. This is Jeu de Mail, which was a French game. There was an Italian game called Pga. There was a game played in Belgium called Cholet, and a game played in the Netherlands called Colvin, okay? Now, the historians think that our game of golf, the modern game of golf, is primarily a combination of Jeu de Mail and Cholet. Both those games, Jeu de Mail was played mainly with a wooden ball across the countryside. And if I back up to that one right there, you can kind of see guys playing around the corner of a hill there. And way off in the distance to the right is probably the 19th hole, or our modern 19th hole. It looks like a little shack that's probably a little, a little halfway house or something like that. But the game of Cholet was played not with a wooden ball, but with a ball that was either made out of wool and stuffed or out of leather and stuffed. And as you know, the golf balls that proceeded after that, the feathery ball was, and I'll look at those in just a minute here, there were golf balls that were put together like a baseball, a little mini baseball. Okay, so that was the origins of the game, a game called Colvin, which came from the games of Jeu de Mail and Cholet. Now, there's two boys, the McDonald brothers, and they're dressed up in their golf regalia. And always when I see this, it reminds me of John Daly, who has some pretty wild pants. What's the name of that company? I think it's Wildmouth or something like that. I forgot what it is, but that's the way they used to dress up to play golf, because it was a very aristocratic game. Only the very rich could play the game because the clubs and the balls were very expensive to manufacture back in those days. Mary Queen of Scots, excuse me for misspelling Scots, it should just have one T. She's the one who started employing military caddies, those two guys on the right, or military cadets, excuse me, to carry her golf clubs, because back in those days they might have 15, 20, 25, 30 different golf clubs that they'd hit the ball with. Mainly they were wooden clubs in the head. And of course they had to carry extra golf balls just in case Mary Queen of Scots hit the ball into the course and they couldn't find it. So that's where the word caddy came from. The first governing body of golf, as we know it these days, was the Honorable Company of Edinburgh Golfers, formed in 1744. And there's William Inglis, who was their first captain. You can see him holding there what they would have called a play club, which is the driver. That's the first club that you start the hole with, and then you'd hit a lot of shots with clubs that looked very similar to that, only had more lofts, wooden heads, wooden shafts, and any kind of leather grip they could fashion out of that. I always put this in there. It's just a funny picture of a guy hitting the ball off in the gorse. If you've played golf in Scotland, you know what that gorse is like, and you don't want to try to hit a golf ball out of there. It can literally snap the shaft of your club in half. and it's very prickly as well. All right, so the first international match was in 1682. Now, this is a match between the Duke of York and John Patterson, two Scotsmen who decided to challenge two Englishmen who claimed that the game was an English game and not a Scottish game. As you know, the Scots are very proud. This match is kind of fictitious. We're not really sure that it actually happened, but it kind of gives you an idea of what a bunker looked like back in those days. Bunkers were actually formed from the cattle, the sheep, and whatever that were on or near the golf course would kind of dig into the ground when the wind blew real hard just to find a hollow that they could hide in. So that's actually what started to form the bunkers. And then, of course, they were on links land, which is very sandy soils, and then the sand would get exposed. So that gives you a little history of how a bunker got formed. But this match supposedly happened in 1682. We're not too sure about that. But the Scotsman won, Duke of York and John Patterson won. Patterson was, by the way, just a shoemaker. And he coined the phrase, supposedly, far and sure. If you've ever been to Chicago Golf Club, you'll see that logo on their shirts. Right underneath the club logo is the phrase far and sure. It's an odd little bit of thing. Okay, golf balls. The first one after the boxwood ball or the wooden ball was the feathery ball. So up on the upper left there, you see actually how they formed the golf ball. It was pieces of leather literally stitched together with a hole in it, and then they would stuff a full top hat full of feathers into that little golf ball and then sew it up. You can see some of the elements over there on the right that actually they had to use to make a feathery golf ball. It was very expensive and very hard to do. That's kind of a picture of old Tom Morris in the middle there. That's how golf professionals of their day actually made most of their money, and they could only make like 2, 3, or 4 golf balls in a day. So they were actually as expensive sometimes as the golf clubs themselves. As you look at some of those other golf balls there, you'll see how they kind of formed over the period of time. That the gutta percha ball started in the late 1880s, 1890s. And we'll talk about a little argument between old Tom Morris and his professional partner, Alan Robertson, here in a minute, because the gutta percha ball took over after the feathery ball because it was a lot cheaper to make, and it kind of started putting the feathery ball makers out of business. And then, of course, we've seen our more modern golf balls. There was the Coburn Haskell ball, which was mainly just a completely rubber ball with some dimples on it, some different configurations on it, just to help the ball in flight better, because the feathery ball was like, it flew like a knuckleball, and it was tough to control, and it didn't stay in the air that long either. Okay, golf clubs. I was fortunate to meet a guy by the name of Dr. Archie Baird. He was a retired veterinarian. He was a member at Muirfield in Gullin, and Archie had a little museum right next door to the pro shop at Gullin, number 1. And he was married to Willie Park's granddaughter. Willie Park won the first Open Championship in 1860. And so he had all kinds of memorabilia. So I actually got to see clubs that were like this from that period of time. Most of them were wooden clubs. And you see the kind of the progression from the first play club on the left there, all the way to a more modern wooden driver, which those of my vintage grew up on playing it with in high school and college. I still have my driver from college. And then over on the right, you see various and sundry kinds of irons. There was all kinds of weird irons. A rut iron, because if your ball wound up in a rut that a wagon wheel had gone through, you had to have a real narrow head to hit through that rut. There was a water iron that actually had a hole in the middle of the club face. So as you swung the club through water, it would pass through the water faster. And Archie had all of these different clubs and examples of them in his museum. I hope that museum is still there. I assume it is. Archie has passed on to the big golf course in the sky. And so I assume they've kept that museum. If you ever get over there, it's right next to Gullin number 1 Pro Shop. And it's well worth your time to spend in there. It's not that big, but it's got some amazing memorabilia. All right, Honorable Company of Edinburgh Golfers. That's what HCEG stands for, and is formed at the Leith Links, okay? That's their first trophy. They had a tournament in 1744, and that also, I'm gonna get to it in a minute, was the first time that formal rules of golf, 13 rules, were written down. That's the Silver Club Trophy, which was given to the champion. And the champion who won that, it was kind of interesting. It was a guy by the name of John Rattray. He was a surgeon, and it was played 3 rounds of 5 holes each. So 15 holes, and all the holes were well over 400 yards, and they're hitting it feathery, and even at the best, they've got a percher ball, but that would have been featheries or boxwood balls way back in 1744. So if you've ever tried to hit a ball that looks like or feels like a feathery, they don't go very far. I mean, you can just hit it as hard as you want, and it won't go 200 yards. So to play, 5 holes that are all over 400 yards, and probably the par of each hole was a 5 or a 6 if they even thought about par in those days. All right, so there is a copy of the original rules of golf. There were 13 of them. The one that I thought was most fascinating, a lot of them are very similar to our rules today, such as, ground under repair and rub of the green and things like that. But the very first rule is fascinating. It says you must tee the ball within 2 club lengths of the hole. Think about that, within 2 club lengths of the hole. So you can imagine what the greens or what the area around the hole look like. You can imagine what the hole looked like. They actually, this is before they had a wooden tee or any kind of a tee to prop the ball up. Players would actually scoop dirt out of the hole, pile it up in a little mound, and hit the ball off that mound, and then put some of the dirt back in the hole. So you can only imagine what the hole looked like after a period of time. So where do we think we got the modern dimensions of a golf hole, 4 1/4 inches? Well, my friend Dr. Archie Baird thinks that some people got so tired of the misshapen hole that they're playing into and then grabbing dirt out of to tee off for the next hole, that somebody cut off a piece of gutter downspout from the roof coming down, which is most of them are pretty round. And oddly enough, he pointed one to me. He says, "You know what, Pro?" He says, "That looks like it's just about 4 1/4 inches." So he thinks that's where the first hole liner came from, a piece of downspout that somebody just inserted in the hole to keep it about the same size and shape. Some of the other rules are kind of crazy, and if you want sometime, I'd be happy to discuss them with you. But that's the one that always fascinated me. You got to tee off within 2 club lengths of the hole. All right, so the first Open Championship, 1860. It was at Prestwick, and I mentioned that Willie Park won it. It was 3 rounds of 12 holes played in one day, so 36 holes in one day. The first hole back then was a par 6 of some 580 or 590 yards, obviously a par 6 because they're hitting a feathery when they first started in 1860. And then, of course, they've been playing that for 150 some years now, 160 some years, excuse me now. So it's very interesting that they chose Prestwick to start and rather than St. Andrews, because old Tom Morris, of course, was the groundskeeper at St. Andrews. And also he was kind of the keeper of the green at some other golf courses and designed several other golf courses. But if you've ever played Prestwick, it's kind of fascinating to see some of the existing holes, which are the same as the old holes. And they actually, what was the first hole back then is a combination of 2 holes on the later part of the back 9. I want to say 14 and 15 or 15 and 16. I'm not sure which it is. So the transition from the belt to the claret jug. Interestingly, young Tom Morris won it 3 years in a row. I think it was 1868 to 1870. So they had a kind of a rule that if you won it 3 years in a row, you got to keep the belt, and that's the belt over there on the right. Pretty fancy, and it's still in the R&A clubhouse if you ever get a chance to get in there. It's a beautiful looking piece of silver on that belt buckle. So then they didn't have it next year in 71. Young Tom won it 1 more time. He won it 4 times, and old Tom won it 4 times. His father won it 4 times. And then they decided to come up with the claret jug over there on the left-hand side, which is what you see all the players, or a similar version of all the players, hoist when they win the Open Championship. So it's kind of interesting, that transition of trophies and how trophies came about. We'll talk about other trophies here in just a minute. So there's Old Tom on the left and Young Tom on the right. And I think there was a movie made about young Tom Morse. Can't remember what the title of it was, but he actually died of a broken heart, they say, because his wife died in childbirth. And I think he died either on Christmas Day or the day after Christmas. But a golfing prodigy he was back in those days. And like I said, both he and Old Tom won the Open Championship 4 times each. We'll talk about how many other players have won it more than 4 times later on here. And there's a group of guys playing golf at the old course. The guy in the very middle with it looks like the white mutton chop beard, that is Old Tom. The guy to his left, to his right, our left, is Alan Robertson, who was, as they considered, the first golf professional. Alan Robertson made his living by making feathery golf balls and making golf clubs. It was also his responsibility to look after the golf course and make sure it kept in decent shape. So he and Old Tom had a bit of a falling out because Old Tom started to play the gutta percha ball, and Alan Robertson was making most of his money by manufacturing the feathery balls, which you could only do, like I said, 2, 3, 4, 5 a day. And when Old Tom started playing the gutta percha ball, and he was kind of Alan Robertson's apprentice, if you will, the old pro wasn't too happy about them. So they kind of had a parting of the ways, but they played a lot of exhibitions together. That's how they made most of their money. They might play for 2 to 5 pounds against other people around the different towns, Musselburgh and St. Andrews, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how they made most of their money, just these little challenge matches. And they were virtually unbeaten as a pair. Speaking of unbeaten as a trio, so this is what we call the golfing triumvirate. This is Barden, Braid, and Taylor. Harry Barden, James Braid, J.H. Taylor, through a period of 20 years, won 16 Open championships. Now that's quite a dominance of the Open, but hey, back in those days, there weren't a lot of good players, but from 1894 to 1914, they won 16 of them between them, the 3 guys. And I think Barden won, he won 6 of them. He won 6 of them himself. And he got the nickname the Stylist because of his beautiful golf swing. And if you look at that finish there, it's almost picture perfect. Braid and Taylor just kind of pounded the ball as hard as they could, but Barden had a beautiful golf swing. And who was the first U.S.-born player to win an Open championship? Well, Walter Hagen, 1922, okay? Because obviously the game was dominated by the Scots and by the British, but mainly by the Scots back in those days. And he won it at Royal St. George in 1922, went on to win several after that, and of course a lot of PGA championships as well. And also was one heck of a player himself, had always dressed very nattily, at least in all the pictures we see of him. All right, how did golf get to the U.S.? Well, I'm going to go one ahead here. In that picture, this gentleman by the name of John Reed and Robert Lockhart, they were the 2 that actually kind of formed what they call the Apple Tree Gang. It's actually John Reed that formed it on a piece of property near his house, which was literally a piece of pasture land and orchard land. And he finally laid out 3 holes. He had ordered some golf balls and fashioned his own golf clubs. And the story goes that he was out there whacking the ball around with his 2 kids, and a policeman came by, and the policeman said, what are you guys doing? And he hit one beautiful shot with it, and then the next shot, he didn't hit it at all. And so he said, this is a stupid game, and went on his way. And John Reed decided to build a 3-hole golf course near his house, and then later on, he and Lockhart started making golf clubs. In fact, the Reed and Lockhart Golf Club Company is still in existence to this day, and they make some pretty pure looking irons, but none of those muscle backs. They weren't going for that kind of thing. And so Back in those days when they first built that golf course, Reed transferred it to a 9-hole layout on Hastings-on-Hudson, which is the original formation of the St. Andrews Golf Club. Now, St. Andrews with an apostrophe on it because it wasn't the old course at St. Andrews, obviously. So those are the gentlemen that are kind of responsible for starting golf in the U.S. All right, the USGA. Interesting story that in 1895, it was the first official U.S. Amateur and U.S. Open. The U.S. Am was won by C.B. McDonald and the U.S. Open by Horace Rollins. They had a championship in 1894, but it was declared unofficial. It's kind of an interesting story. It was kind of declared unofficial because C.B. McDonald, who was one of the guys really involved in forming the USGA, and of course designed a lot of great golf courses, he didn't win it. So he said, oh, this can't be official. We got to have another one. And of course he won it the next year. I don't know how true that story is, but it's kind of a cute story. I'm going to tell you this story in just a minute, but I'm going to jump on to this one. Theodore Habermeyer was the guy who was the first president of the USGA, 1894 to 96. He was in the sugar refining business. Interestingly enough, if you remember, I don't think you still see them at restaurants, but Domino sugar, your little sugar packets that you used to see on tables everywhere, or they would distribute them to you if you wanted some sugar. Usually was a Domino sugar package, and that's the company that Theodore Habermeyer was involved in. And he being the first president of the USGA, they named the trophy after him. And when you win the US Open, it is called the Habermeyer Trophy. That's the one that you get to handle. Now, I'm going to jump back to this because this is a bit of hacienda history as well. This guy's George Von Elm. And you talk about the US Open. He has the distinction of having lost the longest playoff in U.S. Open history in 1931. I don't know if we all get the USGA Journal, but last year they had an article about him inside the back cover. And his nickname was Gix. He was a Dutchman, and he was the pro at Hacienda from 1950 to 53. But in 1931, he tied after 72 holes with another professional by the name of Billy Burke. Back in those days, they finished the last 36 holes on a Saturday. So they had a 36-hole playoff on Sunday. They tied again. They played another 36-hole playoff on Monday. He lost by one shot, 148 to 149 to Billy Burke. So after 144 holes, he lost by one shot. They say it drove him to the drink, or it drove him to be the pro at Hacienda. I'm not sure which, but that was in 1931. He was the pro at our club from 50 to 53. A lot of other great stories about the old Dutchman. Okay, speaking of the U.S. Open, if you've seen the movie Greatest Game Ever Played or read the book, if you haven't, boy, you need to. It's a great story. The kid in the middle, Francis Ouimet, beat Harry Vardon on our left and Ted Ray on our right in a playoff in 1913 at the country club at Brookline. And he literally lived right across the street from the golf course and was a caddy there. And of course, the USGA at that time didn't think it was proper that a caddy was playing, but he went on and won the thing and beat these guys in a playoff. And it's really a cool story. And I think the movie that they made of it was fantastic. The guys that played all of these roles, the guy that played Harry Vardon really had a pretty good looking golf swing. And the guy who played Ted Ray, he was just a big guy and just slashed at the ball. And Francis and little Eddie, was a great, his little caddy was played by a fantastic little actor himself. And he went on to make a lot of money, by the way, little Eddie. Okay, the PGA formed in 1916. Who's that guy on the right? Well, if you don't know, that's Rodman Wanamaker, and you're a PGA member, shame on you. But he was the guy that loaned us a room in his department store building, and that room is still there. For those of us who went back to the centennial meeting of the PGA America in New York in 2016, back to your past president, Tony Latendry, and I went up there and checked out that room. We couldn't get into it, but we could see the plaque on the outside of the room there. That's where the PGA of America was formed in 1916. And Mr. Wanamaker, that's why our PGA Championship trophy is named after him. This is the guy who was our first president, Robert White. Robert White was a Scottish-born teacher who came to the U.S. and loved golf, and so he played golf somewhat professionally, and he was our very first president of the PGA of America in 1916. And interestingly enough, back in those days, there weren't a lot of tournaments, but the very first PGA championship, of course, was won by this guy, Jim Barnes, 1916. And I'm trying to think where they played. Oh, they played that at Sewanee Country Club in New York. And back in those days, that's the Wanamaker Trophy on the right there, of course, which is a pretty big trophy. Back in those days, it was match play. And our PGA championship was match play all the way till 1958. An interesting bit of trivia. Let's see, was it till 57? And 58, I think, was the first year it was stroke play. The guy who lost the last match play championship in the finals is the same guy who won it the first year it was played as stroke play in 58. That's Dow Finsterwald, who I think is still hanging around up in Denver, Colorado. And he lost to Lionel Hebert in the last match play championship and won it outright in the first stroke play championship in 58. Tom Addis will check those years for me, but I think those are the years that happened. But yeah, again, there's Jim Barnes, our first PGA champion, and he could hit the ball a long way back in those days, which is tough to do with the old wooden shafts and wooden club heads. All right, so two interesting trophies, the Varden Trophy and the Vare Trophy. Obviously, the Varden Trophy is named after Harry Varden, his nickname was the Stylist because he had such a beautiful golf swing. And the Varden Trophy is a trophy that the PGA of America awards to the PGA Tour player who has the lowest scoring average with a minimum of 60 rounds in each year. So obviously Tiger Woods has won it more than anybody. In fact, he won it, 9 times, I think, with a period of 99 to 2003. I want to say he won it like 5 years in a row. His lowest scoring average was 67.79. And the trophy itself, the original trophy itself, is actually a molding of Harry Varden's overlapping grip. Of course, he's the one that kind of invented the overlapping grip. Now, it's also used as a trophy for on the European Tour for the Road to Dubai and the Order of Merit. But that's a different looking trophy with a statue of Harry Varden on top of a trophy cup. So that's a little bit different trophy than the original Varden Trophy that's presented by the PGA of America every year. The Vare Trophy is named after Glenna Collette Vare, who won, I think it was 4 U.S. women's amateurs. She was a heck of a player. So that now is the trophy that's given to the lowest scoring average of a female tour player each year from the LPGA. So she won 6 U.S. amateurs, and that's the most ever won by any particular female. So there's your 2 trophies for the lower scoring average on the LPGA Tour and the PGA Tour. All right, let's talk about the big match play championships. The Ryder Cup, that's a picture of 1929. On your left is Mr. Samuel Ryder, who came up with the idea. On your right is Mr. George Duncan, who happened to be the captain for the British team, the British and Scottish team back then. It wasn't a European team back then. And that was the first year that they won it. Interestingly enough, it was played unofficially a couple of years before that. I think in 26, they played an unofficial match in England while some of our U.S. players were over there just playing in the Open Championship. And then the first official one was 1927 in Worcester, Massachusetts, when the U.S. won that one, the first official playing according to Ryder Cup history. And at current, I think the score is 26 U.S. wins and 14 British/European wins. And now that little trophy there, it's only, I think it's 16 or 18 inches tall, probably one of the smallest trophies in golf. on the top of that trophy, of course, Samuel Ryder was a grass seed and other types of seed salesman, but he loved golf, obviously. And on top of that trophy is a silhouette of Abe Mitchell, who happened to be Samuel Ryder's golf coach, golf teacher. So that's that little teeny person on top of that trophy. And over on the right, you can see Walter Hagen over there. Doesn't look very happy because we didn't win it that year, apparently. Well, obviously, we didn't win it that year. All right, so the first male amateur international match is George Herbert Walker, a grandfather to a couple of presidents, great grandfather to one, obviously. That was formed in 1920. He was the USGA president in 1920, and the first actual match was played in 1922 at the National Golf Link. He was a banker from St. Louis, and that he enjoyed amateur golf so much he decided to start this international match between us and the Brits. And to this day, I think the record there is 37 wins US, 9 for the Brits, and a 1 tie. So there's the guy who started the Walker Cup. And if those of you happened to work the Walker Cup at Los Angeles Country Club in 2017, it was an absolutely fantastic match. It's unbelievable how far these kids today hit the golf ball. I had the privilege of watching Cameron Champ hit a few tee shots out of the range at LA Country Club, and it's like 320 yards to the back of that range, and he was flying it into the bushes. Unbelievable how far these kids hit the ball. And the female amateur international matches are called the Curtis Cup, and these are the Curtis sisters, Margaret and Harriet. Obviously a little further along in years when they played in the U.S. women's amateur tournaments. Margaret won 3 U.S. women AMs, and I think Harriet won 1. And also in the Curtis Cup, the Americans have won 29, the Brits have won 8, and 3 ties over the period of years since 1932 when the Curtis Cup was formed. And the LPGA version of the Ryder Cup, of course, is called the Solheim Cup. Started by Karsten Solheim, the guy who started Ping Golf Club Company. And very interesting, if you haven't studied Karsten's history, and he started the Solheim Cup in 1990. He was first a shoemaker and then an engineer for General Electric. And of course, he designed some truly unique, and at the time, most of us thought weird looking golf clubs, but he was kind of the first guy that decided, okay, perimeter weighting is the way to go. And I never forget, for those of you who knew a guy by the name of Bert Reed, he was my first Ping salesman, gosh, way back when I was working part-time at Riverview Golf Course in Santa Ana. And he showed me this putter, and they were selling for $16. And at the time, I think a dozen balls was $12, and a Cushionet Bullseye putter was $12. And Bert showed me this putter, and he said, it's $16, and it made a funny sound when you hit the ball with it. And I said, Bert, you're not going to make a living doing this. Well, Bert retired about 15 years before I did, so maybe he knew what he was talking about. But obviously some very interesting equipment, and Mr. Solheim thought there should be a match much like the Ryder Cup that the women would play in. And the current record is 10 wins for the U.S. and 6 wins for the Europeans, and the Europeans have gotten stronger and stronger every year in both the Solheim Cup and the Ryder Cup, obviously, and it makes for fascinating watching if you like match play. Speaking of match play, do you know what year the Stymie went out? I should have mentioned that way back when we were talking about the PGA Championship. Stymie was very controversial. If you don't know what it was all about, you should look it up. It went out, I believe, in 1952. And it wasn't until 1938 that you had, if your opponent in match play hit his putt or shot right in front, and it was right in front of your ball, you had to figure out a way to play around it. And until 38, you didn't even have a 6-inch margin to move the ball if your balls were that close. We have an old Hacienda scorecard that's exactly 6 inches wide, and I ask people, why do you think this was 6 inches wide way back in the early 50s and late 40s? Well, because that's how you measured whether or not you could move your ball if your ball was within 6 inches of your opponent's. Okay, those three guys there, well, you ought to recognize at least two of them. On the left is Arnie, middle Mr. Jones, and in the right-hand side, Mr. Clifford Roberts, who between he and Bobby Jones started the Masters in 1934. Bobby Jones, he won 13 major titles, and 5 of them were USAMs, 4 US Opens, and 4 British amateurs. Obviously, there wasn't PGA Championship back in those days, and he wouldn't have been playing in the PGA Championship because he wasn't technically a professional at that time. But in 1934, he and Mr. Roberts decided to start the Masters at Augusta. It was originally called the Augusta Invitational. So I'll go to that right there, okay? And that's Horton Smith on the right there, who won the very first Master Championship in 1934. That's a great trivia question. Who are the only 2 players to have won the Masters in the first year that they played in it? Well, he obviously did because that was the first year it was played in 1934. And the other guy, Fuzzy Zeller, he won it the first time he played it. And you can see over there on the left-hand side some memorabilia. The Augusta Invitational Tournament is what it was called for the first couple of years. Backing up to this, Cliff Roberts is an interesting story. The family photographer, the Christian family that had the photography rights to the Masters for years and years, Frank Christian still has, he puts out a great book and still tells a cute story about Clifford Roberts out playing one day with a caddy, and he was held in high esteem for all the people that played at Augusta and the caddies that worked at Augusta. And he had on the 16th hole in that little pond that's in front of the green, well, it's not a little pond, he had built just underneath the surface of the water a little walking ramp that you couldn't see because it was like about 1.5 to 2 inches below the water. And he hit a bad shot in the water, and he told his caddy, so I'm just going to walk out there and get that ball. So he walked about 15 feet out into the lake, walking on this little ramp, and his caddy was so flabbergasted, he just dropped the clubs and he goes, well, Mr. Roberts can walk on water, apparently. So that's a cute story that Frank Christian tells about the Masters. The big 3, I'm going to kind of finish with part of this. Between these 3 guys, they won 34 majors. Of course, Jack won 18. And I bet you most of you out there don't know which between Arnie and Gary won more majors. Actually, Gary did. Gary won 9. And Arnie, I think, won, let's see, it would be 7. Yeah. So Jack 18, Arnie 7, and Gary 9, because he won a lot of open championships, which we might call the British Open. And I mean, they had so much fun, you know, stealing the trophy from each other at Augusta for several years. Arnie and Jack just traded trophies or traded green jackets. A great rivalry that we had between the 3 of those guys. And it goes back to the thinking of the triumvirate with Varden, Braden, Taylor, who won 16 Open championships over a period of 20 years. Well, these 3 guys won 34 majors between the 3 of them in a period of about 25 to 30 years. So pretty cool to know that there's a cadre of golfers who could win majors almost at will. And I think Jack almost finished second as many times as he won major championships. So it leads us to the question, who might be the next big 3? I think I've got pictures here also of the 12th hole of Augusta National, which if you haven't been there yet, and I know we're not going to be able to go this year, but for those of you out there that have not been to Augusta during a Masters, you've got to go sometime. That's just the prettiest shot right there. 12th green there, and they've bought some property up behind the 13th tee. They're talking about extending that back. I'd be curious to know if and when they do that. But right next door to Augusta National is Augusta Country Club. I had the privilege a couple of years ago, the last time I went there, meeting a young lady whose family has been members at Augusta Country Club for years and years. She actually knew and played some golf with Bobby Jones when she was a younger lady. And she sits behind the 9th green at the National every year for the tournament. Her family had a pecan farm, and she would pass off these pralines every year to those of us who were sitting back there with her. Some of the stories she could tell about players coming to Augusta National over the years are really fantastic. She's been seated in that area for 51 years. He's seen 51 Masters championships. So John, with that, I turn it back to you if anybody has any questions, because I know I went through the first part of that pretty quickly. And interestingly enough, just to give you a quick rundown on the majors, who won the most British Opens or Open Championships? Harry Vardon won 6. Braid Taylor and Peter Thompson and Tom Watson won 5. Most U.S. Open victories. Actually, this is interesting. Willie Anderson won 4. Jones and Hogan and Nicklaus also won 4. PGA Championships, Walter Hagen won 5, and Nicklaus has won 5. Masters, well, there's nobody like Jack Nicklaus. He's won 6 of them, and Tiger's won 5. So, John, back to you. If they've got any questions, fire away, sir.
Thank you so much, Andy. Yes, indeed. Can you talk a little bit about Wanamaker and how he came to be involved with that first meeting? It was his hotel room, or it was his room?
Well, it was the room up in, he owns department stores, okay? Big department stores. And it was a room, I think it was the 2nd floor. It was kind of like the, I would say the employee lunch area. And that's where we had our first board meeting. And you kind of see the Constitution that was signed there. And you can see, if you look at that, April 14th, 1960, you can see Walter Hagen's signature down there and a couple of other guys that are hard to read. I didn't see Robert White's signature because I think he became president after they signed this document. But yeah, it was just I think it was a lunchroom or a meeting room upstairs in the Wanamaker building.
And so Wanamaker was not a PGA member?
No, he was not. Just a golf enthusiast who just let us borrow this room so we could have our first meeting.
And he had no involvement in the PGA after that, yet we named the trophy after him.
Correct, because he kind of got us started. Yeah, that was our first president right there, Robert White. And of course, we've had a couple of West Coast presidents, as we all know, Tom Mattis, Pat Riley.
And Andy, a personal question about your time at Hacienda and your role as pro emeritus since 2008. How do you describe that role? Not many of us know what it's like to be a pro emeritus, and if you could talk a little bit about what that title entails, what it means to you, and how unique it is from your perspective.
Well, it's one of those non-paying jobs, but I love the club so much. I go back there and try to help them with their tournaments, do some first tee announcing and things like that. Every now and then I'll meet with, we were going to have the club's centennial last year, but of course COVID kind of put the kibosh on that. So we're going to try to have some tournaments this year, and we're going to try to have an event where we play hickory shafted clubs and old golf balls just to see what it was like when the club was formed in 1920. It was originally designed by a guy by the name of Max Baer, and it was redone a couple of times later by Billy Bell and a couple of other architects, and most recently John Harbottle. And it was developed by a guy by the name of Alfonso Bell, who went on to develop Bel Air, and he was kind of an oil baron, if you will. So I just kind of help out at the club. They're kind enough to let me play there once in a while, and I just enjoy seeing the people again. The folks that I work with, of course, they've gone on the big golf course, and some of the grandchildren who were kids in my junior program are now full members. So it's just great to get back to that club. Left there 13 years ago as pro. They still look up to me and call me coach. And Russell Silty, who's the general manager, and Jonathan Gullia there have been very, very hospitable to me whenever I go back to play and do a little teaching there as well.
Kind of a segue into our plug for next week. Jonathan actually is a regular attendee on the webinar. I don't know if he's on today, but he usually is. And next week we actually have Hacienda Golf Club General Manager Russell Silty on, presenting on the Catalyst on growth mindsets. So it'd be wonderful to have him on. Other questions that have come in. Andy, you talked a little bit about your relationship earlier on before we started the webcast, your relationship with Gary McCord. How did that relationship start?
We were, I wouldn't say arch rivals, but we played against each other in college. I played my first 2 years at UC Santa Barbara and my last 2 years at Cal State Fullerton. Gary played for UC Riverside, and we had several great matches against each other, Canyon Crest Country Club in Riverside, and also at Via Verde Golf Course. And then my funniest Gary McCord story was at Via Verde. And if any of you played Via Verde, the ninth hole is an uphill par 3. It's a very narrow golf course for the most part. And Gary hit his 5 or 6 iron in there about 15 feet above the hole and thought it was really quick, left the first putt short, hit the second putt way past and missed the comebacker and 4-putted the green. And obviously there was a few expletives that came out. And before I could even get to that, back in those days, we played what we called match medal. So you got 2 points for match play in the front, 2 points for match play in the back, and 2 points for your overall stroke play score. So before I even got to the 10th tee, here's Gary just threw the ball down on the ground with his driver and just hit the ball right off the ground with his driver and hit the slow kind of skipping the ground fade. And I said, Gary, what the heck are you doing? He says, well, Thuney, he says, I've been hitting it so far sideways. It says, I thought if I just keep it below the OB stakes, I'll keep this one in play. And he hit one was about knee high to a flounder that just rolled out there about 230. And he was a ride to play with. He had a lot of strange comments, and it was just an overall jovial guy that just enjoyed the game.
Fantastic. Mr. Thuney, thank you so much for your time today. The quiz, making the, another piece of the Catalyst webinar is the creation of the quiz to accompany the presentation to put on the SCPGA landing page. And for those that are taking viewing the Catalyst after the fact. And you keep me on my toes for sure when making this quiz. I have to be Johnny on the spot with the notes. But for everybody that's on the live webcast, of course, you're not required to take the quiz anymore. You get 1 MSR credit simply for attending. Again, please join us again next week with Russell Silty of Hacienda Golf Club talking about growth mindsets. That'll be an eye-opening experience, I'm sure, for all of us. Andy, thanks again on behalf of the Education Committee for the SCPGA. Thank you so much for continuously coming on and supporting the education and keeping us abreast on everything we should know about our past. Thank you, sir. Have a great day, everybody. Stay safe, stay sane.